Let's start with the submarine issue.
Okay.
The Russian subs are fairly quiet, not as quiet as the American subs. And while they do have a lot of them, most of them are not ballistic missile capable. Also, the Russian fleet is split into 4. There's a Pacific fleet, a Baltic fleet, a Black Sea fleet, and an Arctic fleet. So it's not like these are all in one place that they can sail together and do a giant armored punch. And it's very easy to monitor everything that is coming out of the Black Sea because it has to go through the Bosphorus, everything that comes out of the Baltic because it has to go through the Danish Straits, and everything that comes out of Murmansk on the Arctic because there's a buoy line in the North Atlantic. So those 3 components of the fleets, I don't suggest that they're no challenge whatsoever, but it's really easy to have a force multiplier because of the geography. The Pacific Fleet is different because there's a trench right off that they can drop down into, drop below the thermocline, and then maybe be undetected. But the United States has been tracking them there for 60 years, and they're pretty good at it. So I'm not too worried about that. China has to get through the first island chain. And so no matter where the Chinese sail, they have to go through a strait that's monitored visually and with sonar. So I don't mean to suggest that there's no military threat there at all, but it's a very manageable one, and it's impossible for the Chinese and the Russians to coordinate just because of the geography. Let's move to Ukraine. When the Russians failed to take Kiev in the first week, they realized that this wasn't going to be an easy war, and they needed to go back to one of their old school plans that they did in World War II, but then resurrected for Grozny and then polished in Aleppo, and that is a complete obliteration of all civilian infrastructure. The idea being, if you destroy the capacity of people to live in a place, they will naturally split themselves into 2 groups. One becomes refugees, and they leave, and so you don't have to worry about them. And the other become fighters, and so anyone who stays you can shoot on sight. And we're seeing that being carried out in Mariupol right now, where the Russians don't just have their better troops, they've also brought in the Wagner Group, and mercenaries from Syria and the Chechens, and they're literally going block to block, shooting anyone who happens to be left. We know that it's already killed at least 50,000. It's probably closer to 100. And they're just going to go until there's no one left. And that is now the strategy for each and every Ukrainian city. Now, that is horrific. From an amoral point of view, it's a reasonable war plan when your goal is not necessarily to take the territory, but to get past the territory to get to what you really want. The Russians are trying to plug the gaps in the mountains and between the mountains and the seas that have always been the invasion corridors. And there's 2 of those corridors on the other side of Ukraine. One that goes southwest into Romania and one that goes northwest into Poland. That's what they're ultimately after here. And if they don't have to occupy a population in Ukraine, that actually makes their long-term job easier if they can win the war. Here's the problem from the American point of view. You guys remember that 40-mile convoy in the first week of the war that was going down from Belarus to Kiev? Well, it stalled out in a day because they forgot to bring fuel trucks. And 2 days later, the soldiers had to walk back to Belarus because they had run out of food. Now, American defense planners looked at that and got really excited. They're like, oh, wow, the Russians aren't as tough as we thought. We can totally take them in a war. And then everyone had a nap and thought about it for a while. They're like, holy crap, the Russians are not all that. We can totally take them in a war. Since we know that the Russians' intention is not to stop in Ukraine and is to go into multiple NATO countries, we know that that fight between American and Russian forces is destined to happen, and we now know how it will end. The Russians will be obliterated, and they'll be faced with a simple choice: a strategic retreat across the entire line of contact all the way back to Russia, maybe even further, or escalate to involve nukes. Since the Russians see this as an existential crisis, that's a fight we have to prevent. And so the United States, specifically NATO in general, is sending any weapon system that we possibly can that can be carried or put in a truck. Nothing that requires on-site training, nothing that requires a supply chain that involves Americans, because then you have an American defense envelope. Nothing that requires American troops on the ground. But everything else we're sending in, because if we can't kill Russia in Ukraine, nukes come into play. And that is what we're trying to avoid now.
Yeah, sorry, Jim, just one follow-up. Speaking of that, and by the way, I'm Danish by background, and of course the former Secretary General of NATO was Danish as well, and he admitted on television not long ago that, frankly, under his reign, that they had completely underestimated or misread the situation over the years, so to speak. And of course, we know the NATO countries never paid up to the 2% that they had promised in 2011, all of that stuff. But just out of that topic, I mean, I think I heard last night that actually now they will be receiving even helicopters, the Ukraine. And, you know, and then you could ask, well, what's the difference between a helicopter and a fighter jet? I mean, they're both in the air, all of that stuff. My question is really, at what point do the NATO countries give a piece of weaponry that the Russians say, that is one step too far. Now we are at war with NATO?
Yeah, no, and that's absolutely the concern. And that's one of the reasons why the United States is going for man-portable and truck-portable stuff. Countries that are closer to Europe, obviously, even if this war doesn't go nuclear, if you're Poland and you're Romania and you know ultimately the Russians are coming for you, that changes your math and that changes the risks you're willing to take. And if you border Poland or Romania, same general thing. Also, the Central European countries have a lot of equipment that dates back to the Soviet period that the Ukrainians know how to work, so you don't have to worry nearly as much about that logistical supply line. The concern is going to be fuel. Ukraine used to get all of their fuel from Russia, and now we're in a situation where if you're going to supply them with something like a helicopter, that takes a lot of fuel. And so there are going to be trucks that have to cross, and there has to be supply chains going back and forth. Luckily, a fuel truck doesn't necessarily require a NATO driver. You can just turn that over to Ukraine. But I totally agree that we are moving into a gray area here, bit by bit by bit. The systems that the Americans are providing are upgraded systems of the things that the Ukrainians already know. So, for example, when we went from javelins to stingers, not a big leap in terms of training. When we went from javelins to switchblades, same general thing. And once you can operate a switchblade, you can operate a switchblade B, which is the one with the bigger warhead. So bit by bit, we're moving up. The opportunity / concern for the next stage that the Americans are considering are Predator and Reaper drones. That requires a little bit more maintenance because they're not fire and forget. They actually come back and have to land. But if we can get Predators and Reapers into the Ukrainians' hands, they can blow up the Kerch Strait Bridge. And then all of a sudden, the Crimea is completely cut off. And from a war point of view, that would be fantastic because most of the gains the Russians have made have been out of Crimea. We're in war. There are risks. Yeah. Keeping the war in Ukraine is the best way the U.S. has right now to manage that risk. I don't mean to suggest it's perfect.
Sure.
Are we going to be able to keep it in Ukraine, in your estimation? I mean, you're negotiating with a terrorist, right? Essentially, they have a gun to your head, and which is nuclear weapons, and we're because of that trying to negotiate. We're being incremental, trying to appease.
There's no negotiation with the Putin government on this. The Russians, the government and the people see getting control of those gateways as an existential threat, and they know because of their advanced decrepitude in their demographic structure that this is their last chance. If they don't do it now, it won't happen, and then the next time there's a real war, the Russians will be unmoored in the Eurasian hordelands, and they will have nowhere to hide and nowhere to regroup. There's no defensive position east of the Polish and the Bessarabian gaps. The Russians would be completely destroyed in the next war. That's why they're doing it now. They are not interested in talking. Any talk of negotiations is just fluff to distract from the fact that they are in the first stage of a war that is meant to obliterate 2 countries and occupy all or more of 5 more.
Given that I feel like there has to be almost a calling of that, as scary as it sounds, a nuclear bluff, right? I mean, if you continue to appease because of your fear of that detonation of that jacket, right? Ultimately, you're going to lose this war in Ukraine. So, what do you do? when you're negotiating?
Yeah, I would
tariffs?
argue that there's nobody in the West who's doing the appeasement right now. There's definitely levels of commitment that are different. And I think we're only a few weeks away from either the Europeans, number one, putting a spine in Germany and cutting off the energy exports, or number two, the Ukrainians just saying screw it and blowing up the pipelines themselves. Because right now, the Russians are getting almost $1 billion a day of income from their sales to Europe, and that is not a tenable situation, especially considering what is at stake here for the rest of the world.